Chapter 5 is energy expenditure and fatigue. So energy expenditure is another term for metabolic rate, which is the rate that we produce and use energy, and the energy that we use is ATP. But we cannot measure ATP directly. We have no way of quantifying the number of ATP that you produce or the number of ATP that you use. So if you want to quantify the amount of energy that you're using, we need to use a different value. So we know that energy expenditure, or the amount of ATP that you produce and use, is directly related to heat production. And this formula here we're going to use a lot for the rest of the semester. So it's an important formula. And this really is a summary of what we've talked about in Chapter 2. So in order to make ATP, we need some type of food, right? So if we're going into glycolysis, we start with glucose. If we're going into beta oxidation, we start with fat. Okay, so here we have either fat or carbohydrate. We also need to input some oxygen. Okay, remember the oxygen needs to be available in the electron transport chain. So into energy metabolism, we put fat or carbohydrate, we put oxygen, and as a result, we end up producing ATP. One of the byproducts of ATP is CO2. If you remember, we produce CO2 in the intermediate step, and we produce CO2 in Krebs cycle. We get some water. We didn't do water counts, but if you looked back through the pathways, you'll see that we do produce water along the way. And then another byproduct of energy production that we haven't talked about yet is heat. Okay, so in the process of taking carbohydrate and fat and oxygen and making ATP, we end up with the byproducts of carbon dioxide, water, and heat. And so there's a direct relationship between energy expenditure, ATP production and use, and heat production. Okay, that's what this means here. There's a direct relationship. They're directly proportional. So although we can't quantify ATP, we can quantify heat because heat is easy to measure. So the unit of heat production is called a calorie. So when we talk about calories, we're talking about an amount of heat. And when we're talking about food or humans, we're not really talking about calories, we're talking about kilocalories or kcals. So from here on out, we will refer to calories as kcals. Because technically, calorie can be spelled with a capital C or a small c, and depending on whether it's a capital or a small, it's a different unit. So instead of, to prevent that confusion, we're just going to use the term kcal. So a kcal is a unit of heat. It represents an amount of heat. The amount of heat that it represents is the amount of heat that would be required to raise the temperature of 1 liter of water 1 degrees Celsius. So if you have a liter of water, it's the amount of heat that it would take to increase the temperature of that water by 1 degree Celsius. And the precise definition is not important. The most important thing that you understand about a calorie is that it's a unit of heat production. It represents an amount of heat. So how do we measure heat production or caloric expenditure, or basically measuring heat production as an estimate of caloric expenditure? Well, we can measure it directly. We can measure it indirectly. So the direct measure of calorimetry occurs in a chamber like this. You would put the person in the chamber. The chamber is surrounded by tubing that is filled with water. Okay, cold water goes in, and then the water comes out. And the water is being warmed by the heat that's being produced in this chamber. So if we know how much water is coming in, and we know the temperature when it comes in, we know how much water is coming out, we know the temperature when it comes out, then we can measure how much heat is being produced inside the chamber, and then we can use that to quantify the amount of heat being produced and therefore the amount of energy expenditure. The problem with this system, it requires a large chamber, as you can see, which is expensive. Other problems with this technique is that there is some energy, heat energy, that's liberated from the body that is not, it doesn't leave the body. It causes the body temperature to rise. So we may not capture all the heat, so we could underestimate caloric expenditure that way. Other problems is if you're on a piece of exercise equipment, the equipment itself is going to be liberating heat, and so that is going to throw off our calculation. This technique cannot measure rapid changes in heat because it takes time for the heat to be absorbed into the walls of the room and for the temperature of the water to change. Sweating affects the result. So basically what I'm getting at is that this is not a practical way to measure caloric expenditure. Okay. So where are we at now? Indirect calorimetry. So rather than directly measuring heat production and using it as a quantification of energy production, what we do is we estimate heat production through the measurement of VO2. Okay? And VO2 is oxygen uptake, oxygen use, or oxygen consumption. And all three of those are interchangeable terms which you'll hear. So basically what we're doing is we're measuring how much oxygen are you using. So in the process of doing whatever work an individual's doing, how much oxygen are they using? Because we know that all of the things in this formula are directly related to each other. Okay? In order to make more ATP, we have to use more oxygen. And in the process, we produce more heat. Okay? So what we do is, instead of measuring heat production directly, we measure oxygen consumption, and we use it to estimate heat production, which we then use as an estimate of energy expenditure. Okay, so energy expenditure, heat production, and VO2 are all directly related to each other, and so knowledge of one would allow you to predict the other. Okay, so what we're going to do, rather than directly measuring heat production because of the disadvantages with the chamber, what we're going to be doing is we're going to actually be measuring VO2, which is really easy to use, and we're going to do some calculations that will allow us to calculate how much heat was produced as a result of consuming that much oxygen or using that much oxygen. And then that's going to give us an idea of how much energy is being expended, how much work you're doing. So oxygen consumption is really easy to measure because all we need to know is how much oxygen are you taking in and how much oxygen are you breathing out. Okay, so how much do you inhale and take into your lungs, and then how much do you exhale? Okay, because at any time you inhale, you take in a volume of air, you take in a certain amount of oxygen, and when you exhale, you're exhaling air which also contains oxygen. So if we know the amount that was taken in, subtract the amount that you exhaled, the difference is going to be the amount that you actually use, VO2. Very simple calculation. So indirect calorimetry looks something like this, and you might have seen this in the lab. Okay, so you've got an individual on a treadmill or a bike, and you've got this tubing here that's open to the room. Okay, so you're breathing in room air, Room air has some constants that we know about, which we'll talk about later in this chapter, but we know exactly what percentage of room air is made up of oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc. When you inhale, the air goes into this, what we call a pneumatic, which is part of the mouthpiece, which measures the volume of air that you're taking in. So the system knows exactly how much air you're taking in and how much air you're exhaling. You've got a one-way mouthpiece here that prevents you from exhaling air into the room. So all the air that you inhale is going to come from the room, and all the air that you exhale is going to go through this tubing. You're also going to be wearing a nose clip so that we capture all of the air coming in and out through the mouthpiece. This mouthpiece will carry the air into a mixing chamber. It's just basically a container that takes takes the air that you're exhaling, collects it in a chamber, and then there's going to be a sampling catheter. You can't see it in this picture, but you might want to look in the lab. There's a little sampling catheter that at regular intervals takes little samples of your air and puts it into gas analyzers, and then the analyzers will tell you what is in your exhaled air. So what percentage of your exhaled air is oxygen and CO2. And we won't go into any detail really about how we calculate that, but in very basic terms, what we're getting from this is we want to know how much oxygen you took in, subtract the oxygen you breathed out, and that's going to tell us how much oxygen you used. Okay? And there's only one place in the body that we use oxygen, and that's the electron transport chain. So any air that you used was used in the electron transport chain. This picture here, this is just a picture of a portable unit, which basically is all the same components in a much smaller system.